Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and this is my co-host and colleague, Sam.
Sam Wang here, professor of neuroscience and molecular biology and founder of the Princeton Election Consortium, election.princeton.edu.
I feel like every week we start by saying what a week it's been, but I think it might be true. This last week we saw a series of bombs in the tri-state area that brought the issue of national security back to the forefront of the campaign. We had the birther issue reemerge when Donald Trump announced that he had resolved the issue once and for all, concluding that Obama was born in the states, and then blamed Hillary Clinton for having started the whole birther movement to begin with. We've seen Obama become increasingly assertive, and we've seen the polls tightening, at least pretty significantly from what we've seen. And here we go next week on Monday night. We will have a presidential debate that will probably be watched by more people than any other in our history of televised debates, which started in 1960. And the candidates are going to have some opportunities over the course of these three debates to speak to huge audiences. And, you know, this is an area where social scientists tend to think that debates don't have the capacity to really remake the race. But as we keep saying with this particular campaign, who knows how this is going to play out. So maybe we can start with the polls and the context within which this first debate is going to take place. Sam, you have been saying pretty consistently that the probability is still pretty strong that Hillary Clinton is going to win. There's been many analyses that she has many more ways to get to the Electoral College votes that she needs than Donald Trump does. And so that still stacks the odds are in her favor, but the polls really seem to be tightening in a lot of these battleground states consistently. So I've been looking forward to asking you what you're seeing and what you think of how close is this race? Is this just a natural tightening, or do you think this has changed significantly since where we were in August?
Yeah, this is a great question, Julian. My answer is going to be, let's see. So there's some complications to the answer, but let me try to start with the simple, basic things here. So broadly speaking, it's been a pretty tight but consistent race all season. Whether you look at national polls or look through the lens of mechanisms of the Electoral College, it's been for most of the season a race in which Hillary Clinton has been ahead effectively by 4 to 6 percentage points. And if you look in the Electoral College, that translates to a pretty convincing electoral victory if one examines state polls, which give what I call the meta margin, which has also been in a similar range. So that's where things have been.
What's the meta margin?
The meta margin is how much state polls would have to swing in order to create an electoral tie. So the general idea would be that an electoral tie would be 269 electoral votes each. How much would state polls have to swing across the board? And so it's sort of the same idea as a median or average margin in national polls. It's just that it only uses state polls because state races are how we select a president. So that's the idea.
Yeah.
So both the national margin and the state meta margin, which we calculate over at election.princeton.edu, both of those have narrowed significantly in the last few weeks. And so it's probably important to make a distinction between where conditions are today and where things are going to be on election day when voting actually takes place, right? So for instance, if you're walking in the rain and you get a little splash of rain in your face, you don't extrapolate that to saying, well, you know, actually there's a deluge going on here. What you say is, well, that was a little bit of a splash. And so one general difficulty with interpreting polls is knowing, is this where things are going to be? And in past elections, a good indicator of where things are going to end up on election day is to average out all the places where opinion has been through a campaign season. So, and so with that caveat, it is true that right now the race is, as measured by state polls, it's as narrow as it's ever been. Clinton is only effectively ahead by 1.5 percentage points as of today. In national polls, right after this business with with her having difficulty on a hot day, like, and the announcement of her pneumonia.
Yeah.
That was when opinion went as weak as it did for her, and opinion for her at a national level was that her lead was down to 1 or 2 percentage points. Since that time, opinion seems to have come back a bit, and now she's up to 3 or 4 percentage points, which is kind of getting into where she was before Flem Ghazi. And so I'm sorry, I just love saying Flem Ghazi. Yeah, Flem Ghazi. But anyway, and so things do seem to be coming back, and I think state polls will again start coming back. But it is certainly true that in an election today, we would have a nail biter. Imagine if the election were held today based on the polls that we have available to us. We'd be up late watching, the old golden oldies like Florida and Ohio, but we would also be watching states like North Carolina and Wisconsin, and we would be, whoever we supported, we would be watching those states with great interest to figure out where things are at. So that's where things are today.
So you're anticipating that after the debate or in the coming weeks, that will change a bit and we'll go back to where we were.
Well,
or not necessarily.
Probably. Yeah. I would say probably, but not necessarily. I think that this is a domain in which there's a phenomenon that people in statistics and in finance and all these other domains where people have to deal with data changing over time. Yeah. There's a phenomenon called regression to the mean, where if you know where the data has been in the past, that's probably where it's going to be in the future. And so broadly speaking, I would say that it is more likely that opinion will move towards Clinton because we have months and months of measurements where people have been asked how they feel about a candidate, and those months and months of data tell us that, broadly speaking, people who have a preference support Hillary Clinton by a margin of about 4 or 5%. So among decided voters, that's where things have been. So all other things being equal, things should move things back towards it. So so I would say, based on that, whatever the journalists say about the debate, the probable effect of the debate, whatever happens during it, is to push things back towards that equilibrium. So that, now there's a horse race way of putting that, which is expectations are lower because of Hillary Clinton's illness and because of the bad stories. And so things are going to punch reset, and it's a chance for the candidates to punch reset. So that would be another way of saying what I'm saying without the math.
And Clinton asked the other day, I don't even remember where she was. She's the one who said, "Why am I not 50 points ahead of him?" I mean, she raised the question that many people are asking.
Yeah. So the difficulty with, when I saw that news story, I thought, So I actually spent a year away from science, and I worked on Capitol Hill on Senate staff. And the problem is that I wore my academic identity on my sleeve. And as a going away present, my mentor on the Hill, who was a member of committee staff, gave me a lapel pin that said, "I'm surrounded by idiots." And I, this is a fascinating present because it was this combination of being a compliment because evidently I was the smart guy, but it was also this backhanded statement, "You think you're surrounded by idiots." And so when she says, "Why am I not winning by 50%?" There is the optics of that. There is a serious answer to that, which is that it's something that we've talked about before on this program, which is voter polarization. 40+% of people will not vote for the other party's candidate, no matter what. And so there's some large fraction of people who simply will not vote for Hillary Clinton. There is some fraction of people who would not vote for Obama or Romney. And this year Trump has that fraction that's naturally set against him, plus the bonus fraction of say Republicans and Republican-leaning independents who are just not going to vote for him because of his extremism. And so I think that what Hillary Clinton is giving voice to is the fact that there's so much polarization that just there is some large fraction of voters who will not consider voting for her.
And that has been one of the big stories, I think, of the campaign. Trump is testing this proposition more than anyone has. And every election, at least in the last few cycles, we talk about polarization, and we've talked about red and blue. And, all the experts explain all the different reasons why polarization is so strong in this country. But there has been this speculation, and we discussed it early in this podcast about, can you have another 1964 election where Barry Goldwater basically led many Republicans to vote for the Democratic candidate? And Donald Trump tests this because not only is he erratic on Republican policies, but he's caused so much consternation with leading Republicans. You have this week, President George H.W. Bush basically sent out word that he's going to vote for Clinton. But yet the polls are doing what you suggested they would be doing, certainly in the most of the Republican states. It doesn't look like Republicans are going to switch, even if Trump is at the top of their ticket, or at least not a lot of them.
Well, here are the cross currents that I see. I certainly agree that public Republicans, well-known people like George H.W. Bush and national security people and so on, are coming out against Trump, and in some cases like Bush, saying that they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton. So that's one cross current. The other is in the last few weeks, this narrowing of polls, which is a few percentage points at its extreme so far, which was about a week ago. It was 3 or 4 percentage points gained by Trump. But it was not a loss, not a weakening for Hillary Clinton. It was a gain for Trump, and it was accompanied by a decrease in the measured number of undecided voters. And so one possible interpretation of that is that undecided Republican voters, at least a few percent of them, some fraction of them, are coming home. They are making their peace with Trump as their nominee, and they're saying, okay, you know what, he's our guy, we're going to vote for him. And so I think that it looks like that might be what's happened in the last few weeks. It's an interesting open question whether that will reverse itself, or whether those people, having found it within themselves to tell a pollster what they're thinking, they're able to verbalize it consciously. Will they stick with it? And so I think that let's call them tranches, tranches of undecided voters. So some of the Republican tranche of undecided voters may have come home in the last week or two.
Yeah, and the other part of it, I just gave a talk over at Loyola University about this. The conception is still that Donald Trump is very different than the Republican Party. And so we contrast George H.W. Bush with Donald Trump. But, there's another way to look at it in that ultimately Republicans can come home, because even if he is an outlandish candidate and certain things he says are beyond the spectrum, a lot of what he's talking about has pretty strong roots now in the Republican Party as it has developed, certainly since 2008 and 2010. And so you take an issue like immigration, where quickly there's often discussions, boy, is he far out on this issue, he's too harsh. But that hardline anti-immigration stance has really deep roots now in Republican politics, certainly in congressional politics. I think, part of it might not be so surprising that maybe some feel embarrassed just because of the coverage of who Donald Trump is, but it's not clear he's such an outlier. His tax plans now are shaping up to be supply side tax policies, and his national security programs. Not all of them, but a lot of them fit pretty clearly with what we've been hearing from the GOP for years now.
Well, the birther thing, for example, actually reflects this a bit. So if you look at surveys of Republican voters, anywhere between 25 and 40% of Republican voters report falsely believing that Obama was born outside the United States. And so despite the fact that Obama was born in Hawaii, which last I checked is an American state, they believe that he was born in Kenya. And these 25 to 40% of voters found their voice in Trump. And so he's a personification of some wing of the Republican Party that is willing to believe that the first black president was not actually born in America. These are people who, as you say, have pretty strongly held views about, say, Muslims and immigrants, despite the fact that many of them may have never met a Muslim, but they know how they feel about Muslims. Mm-hmm. And so he's giving them voice. So at some level, he gives them voice. And because those views are now stated over the airwaves every day, they become normalized. And so if you look at how people form their opinions, people take their cues from public figures. And now we've got a public figure that is saying that all these views are acceptable. And those people are probably they're not going away after the election. And so whoever wins in November, those people exist, and they are now clearly identifiable as, the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party.
There's a terrific new book I just started reading. It's called Asymmetrical Politics by two political scientists, and it's about this. And it really is arguing that in terms of polarization, in terms of the political styles of the party, there is a difference in terms of where the two parties have gone. And part of what they argue is the power that the conservative media has over many Republican voters in terms of shaping their perception of issues and what kinds of questions they even discuss. Birtherism, or whatever you call it, is part of that. And the parties have moved apart on this. They argue the Republicans have become very an ideologically driven party, including how they even get the news. And so birtherism comes directly out of this mindset. And it's not surprising Trump was at the forefront of this in 2011 and 12. And here he is as the candidate.
Yeah, I would view this as a trend in the last 20 years. I've got a piece coming out of the American Prospect in the near future. Excellent. Describing how voting has become more reliable, both geographically, like red state versus blue state, and less changeable during a campaign, which is what we're seeing this year. And it all started about 20 years ago. And, around 20 years ago is when Republicans became, as a national party, became far more unified and in some ways quite doctrinaire, but really I think the main issue there is just issues for the Republican Party became nationalized. So for Democrats, it might be okay to have varying stances on, say, guns. It might be okay to have varying stances on abortion. But in the Republican Party, there's a particular view that is held to be generally acceptable on taxes, on guns, on abortion. And if you stray from that, then you're not really a Republican. And so there's this nationalization of issues. And I think that around the mid-90s is when that messaging became very strong, very coherent on their side. And that appears to be a central force in the polarization that we've seen over the last 20 years.
So here comes the debate. And based on what we've just said, this is a critical moment, not because of the debate, but just the moment in where the election is. Meaning, if this sticks, if the polls don't change, and we stay about where we are, that means we will have a nail biter in November, and this could go either way. Or the other scenario is you have kind of move away from the polls we've seen in the last few weeks back to where we had been earlier. And here's the debate. The debates, as we said, some people say they are entertaining or that they confirm perceptions that people have of candidates rather than creating them. Is there any possibility you think, and I don't have an answer to this, that this could be different just because of the sheer number of people who might watch this and who might see clips of it afterwards on our new internet world, which we didn't really have before like this? Or do you think that the debate still is going to be limited in how it could move the polling?
Well, just to state the obvious, debates are not going to be moving people who are already committed to either candidate, but they can certainly get people who are on the fence, who think they're on the fence, to get off the fence. They might do something where third-party candidates. If this year is like past years, then third and fourth party candidates are going to fade in the finish. Right now we have Gary Johnson supporters and Jill Stein supporters. Yeah, this debate is likely to have exceptionally good viewership. And so it is safe to say that many of those people are going to find out, they're going to get a look at the candidates side by side. So general rule of thumb, in any kind of perceptual psychophysics is if you want to tell whether one thing's longer or larger than another thing, then you put them next to each other and you get a better measure. If you want to tell whether you like Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump better, this is your big chance to see them next to each other, watch them talk with one another or raise their voice, whatever they do. And you can see them side by side. So this is going to be a big chance for whatever people's tendencies are to shake out. So I think it may be that people had their tendencies beforehand. For instance, Jill Stein supporters tend to favor Hillary Clinton. Gary Johnson supporters split about equally between the two candidates. I think this is a chance for everybody to, kind of shake their heads a little bit and say, okay, I'm now going to go where I was headed. Even though I didn't realize I was headed there, now I'm headed there. So I think that what the social scientists say is not false.
Yeah.
I think it was latent in people all along. It's just that it takes people a while to get there, and the debate is a time to help people get there.
I think I was trying to think of what each candidate is going to need to do or need to avoid. And I was thinking for Hillary Clinton, the 2000 debates could be something that happened to her when Al Gore faces off against George W. Bush and was so confident that he should win and would win. But you had all those images of him sighing or him frustrated, which ultimately turned against him. You could imagine, not in terms of the detail of what she says, but this is a challenge that she faces. And that plays into a kind of sterile perception some people have about who she is.
Why am I not beating you by 50%?
Right. And you could imagine her sighing and rolling her eyes and saying, I can't believe he's doing this well. And she's gonna have to avoid that. I think that would be damaging. And he has to. I don't think this is the time to do what he did in the Republican primary debates. I do think he needs to temper himself because, as you're saying, this is in part an effort to win over either undecided voters or to just solidify his support with Republicans who are a little nervous about him. And he has to avoid. The other thing I was thinking, he has to avoid a moment, a Jerry Ford moment. In 76, Gerald Ford was asked about, whether the Soviets have control over Eastern Europe or what he thought about Soviet power in that area. And he says there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, which just left the moderators stunned. Ford, in that case, it wasn't that he didn't know the facts. It was that he meant to say something else. He meant to say he didn't accept Soviet domination as being legitimate, as some of his conservative critics were saying. But it came off as if he didn't know the basic parts of policy. And I think Trump, that would be something that could hurt him if Clinton handled it well, given all these concerns that are circulating about what he knows.
Maybe people surrounding him should medicate him.
But I imagine it's going to be quite an intense confrontation between the two of them.
So one thing I'm noticing, that just to take this in a slightly different direction, one thing that's really become apparent in the last few weeks is not just that there's been a movement in presidential polls, but it's a repeat of things that have happened in past elections, which is that Senate and House polls are moving in the same direction. So previously it looked like Democrats are narrowly favored to retake control of the Senate. It looked like they were going to win a pretty large popular majority in the House, even though they weren't headed for retaking the House. Both of those indicators have moved towards Republicans in the last few weeks. It's been really striking that the big move since the last week of August to now, if the election were today, it is more likely than not that Republicans would retain the House, retain the Senate very narrowly, and it would be pretty certain that Republicans would retain the House. So both of those metrics have moved. It's like all these indices have moved in the same direction. The index that has not moved as much is the net approval of Barack Obama. That one has stayed relatively good. And so what's interesting is that people's opinions about how they're going to vote have shifted. How they feel about the current Democratic president has shifted, but not as much. And so it feels to me like things are, certainly they move together. And will they stay where they are now? We're going to find out in a few weeks.
And I imagine because of that, we're going to hear a lot about Obama in these debates. I mean, it's been remarkable to watch how closely Hillary Clinton has linked herself to his fate or to his legacy, how much he has intervened directly in the campaign. And in many ways, I continue to think that Donald Trump is, while he talks about crooked Hillary and all of this stuff, what he's really doing is making an argument to repudiate a lot of what Barack Obama stood for, not just in terms of ACA, but in terms of the diversity of this country or our interaction with the rest of the world. And so I imagine that even with Obama this popular, Trump will bring in these themes as he debates Hillary Clinton. So what's your favorite poll of the week? What's the most interesting thing that you've seen?
Oh, well, the ones that I'm watching most closely, I'm actually watching Senate polls pretty closely. Right now, I am, as everyone is, I think, who's watching the political race this year, watching presidential polls. And of course, I'm watching places like North Carolina and Ohio and so on. But I'm really watching Senate races. Right now, in New Hampshire, it looks like the incumbent Republican Kelly Ayotte is ahead by a median of 2 percentage points. And so I'm watching that pretty closely. I'm watching Missouri. I'm super interested in that because it's Roy Blunt, the Republican, against Jason Kander, the Democrat. And Kander was said to be accused of being weak on guns. And he released this amazing 30-second ad in which he reassembles an assault rifle blindfolded. And then he takes off his blindfold and says, "I endorse this message because I'd like to see Roy Blunt do that." And so, so I'm watching that. Like, I don't know, like, I don't think you're weak on guns if you can, reassemble an AK-47 blindfolded. And so I'm super interested in the Senate races because, as I said, they tend to follow presidential races. And I think that, it takes a while for them to catch up with where national mood is. But, I'm interested.
Are those
and
two?
Finally, just one last point.
Yeah.
I'm really watching national polls because they respond the quickest.
Those two races that you just mentioned, have the polls been changing at all, or are they pretty steady?
They've shifted a little bit. As of
Yeah.
3 weeks ago, so the Blunt versus Kander race in Missouri has been narrowly favoring Blunt all along.
Yeah.
So the thing I'm watching for there is whether it shifts in favor of Kander because he had this, one amazing ad. The New Hampshire Senate race favored the Democrat a few weeks ago and has shifted slightly towards the Republican. And so I view that as being a microcosm of the national political race. So I think if any listener wants a rapid gratification about what's happening, they should watch the national polling average over at HuffPolster. But speaking for myself, I am paying close attention to these smaller issues because I think they're also indicators.
Well, that wraps up our episode. So thanks for joining us, and we'll be back next week with Politics and Polls.
Thanks, everyone.
You've been listening to Politics and Polls, a podcast series about the 2016 presidential election produced by WooCast. The content discussed in this podcast is intended to be informational only. It does not represent nor reflect the views of Princeton University or the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs.